This is era 1 and 2. Era 1 and 2 goes from 1400 all the way up through 1750. So early exploration all the way through up until the French and Indian War. So exploration, but since this is U.S. history, mostly it's about colonization, especially English colonization. If we look at pre Columbus Native Americans, most pre Columbus Native Americans were agriculturally based. They had wide trade networks with a variety of languages and belief systems. There you can see a map of their interconnected trade networks. Those trade networks, of course, are how not only information, but then later with the Colonial Exchange disease, traveled from various parts of the Americas. Keep in mind that we don't quite know how Native Americans got here. There is the common belief that it was due to the land bridge, but there's also the possibility that they came by ships. But by the time that Columbus arrived here, this is sort of, we had civilizations risen and fallen by the 1400s in terms of Native Americans, with, of course, your largest Native American civilizations being groups like the Mayans, the Incas, and the Aztecs. So why Europeans? During the 1400s and then 1500s, we had changes in society. You had overpopulation, the rise of new governments. You had trade, commerce, and prosperity. The Renaissance spirit, that need to look, discover, engage. The technology improved. We saw advancements in shipbuilding and map making. The printing press led to the spread of knowledge. You also have new products that led to expanding trade with Africa, India, and China. And so people were looking for these new trade routes that would be faster to these places, especially when it came to things like the spice route and such. We saw a religious conflict. You had your Catholic governments like Spain and France, and then you had your Protestant revolution in places like Germany and England. And those tensions over these religious groups led to both religious groups seeking a place to practice their religion freely, but then also governments trying to establish their dominance as that religion in that region. And we started engaging in the slave trade from Africa as Europeans began entering into the market. This is, of course, the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, the biggest thing you need to know about the Columbian Exchange was, of course, the fact that this was the exchange of goods and ideas from the Americas to Europe. And of course, the two most significant things that came to the Americas was livestock, especially horses, and disease. Those are the two that probably created the most change within the Americas, especially North America, when we're talking about the impact on American history. So this map shows colonization of the Americas. You can see the green is Spanish territory, the peach there is Portuguese, blue is French territory, the British territory is red, the Russian territory is the brown, and then just that little bit of purple is the Dutch territory. Keep in mind that this map is pre 1763, so it's prior to the French and Indian War, where the American colonies, the British American colonies, were just right on the East Coast. After the French and Indian War, that boundary will, of course, shift. So let's talk briefly about the Spanish plantation colonies. Keep in mind that for the most part, the most northern portion of the Spanish was, of course, into areas like New Mexico, Texas, California, and Florida. Okay. The reasons for settlement was gold, sugar plantations, and missions. Their treatment of Native Americans was to convert, exterminate, or intermarry. They intermarried to form alliances. They tried to convert them to Catholicism. That conversion was often forced conversion. But for the most part, the most significant thing that the Spanish did to Native Americans was enslave or exterminate. North America was pretty much a buffer zone, a defensive buffer between their more commercial and trading empires in Mexico and South America, and so you don't see as much Spanish settlement in that area, which is why when we go forward into, say, the Mexican-American War, Texas ended up being the northernmost province for that region, and it's part of the reason why they couldn't hold on to it as much. When it came to the French are going to settle for the fur trade, mostly beaver fur. That's, of course, a picture of an early beaver, to find a route to Asia and missions. Their treatment of Native Americans was to trade, convert, work with, or intermarry. They never tried to take away from Native American living area. They claimed territory and formed trading posts and tried to convert the Indians. We, of course, talked a lot about the Jesuit Indians. I talked about this in class, but the French had the most valuable farming land by being in the Great Lakes region as well as the Ohio River Valley region. However, because they set up mostly trading posts, and even though they had large settlements like Montreal and Quebec, most of their regions that they were able to retain, and also New Orleans, that center sort of area, which is where the British are going to occupy their forts during the French and Indian War, they're not going to be able to hold on to. Then you have the English. The reasons for the settlement for the English was farming. Remember the enclosure movement? This is where the English turned to sheep grazing for their wool and textile industry. They got rid of farmland, which meant no jobs and no food. So you had to find a place for food. You also had to find a place for the overpopulation. They were looking for natural resources. They were engaging in mercantilism, which is where one person or nation could grow rich over the expense of the other. And you have the Protestant Reformation. Their treatment of Native Americans was to negotiate or exterminate. They didn't enslave the natives, and they didn't try to convert them. We had some rare instances of the praying Indians, those that might have tried to convert near Puritan villages, but they were very few. And for the most part, our examples are of massacres, or what we call wars, but were massacres. Roanoke is, of course, the picture here. It's the first English colony, but it was not the first permanent colony. The first permanent colony was, of course, Jamestown in 1607. The Jamestown settlers came for gold, glory, and God, the 3 Gs. The first 150 settlers had a difficult start, but, of course, were saved by Pocahontas and the Powhatan Indians. However, in 1609, when 600 settlers arrived, the Powhatan Indians felt betrayed and started attacking the settlers. This led to 1609 being starving time. The Jamestown colony was only saved in 1612 by John Rolfe and that brown tobacco. Brown gold, I meant. So brown gold tobacco in 1612. King James I originally called this a noxious weed, but as tobacco began to sell very well, he's going to change his tune. Tobacco needed lots of land, which meant plantations went deeper and deeper inland, isolating themselves from Jamestown. Because of the heavy demand for labor, we saw the Virginia colony moving to the headright system, which meant that you got 50 acres per person that you brought over to the New World, including indentured servants. So you could receive 50 acres of land for yourself and 50 acres for any person that you might bring, which led to an increasing amount of labor being done by indentured servants. That will, of course, change in 1619. In 1619, we have the first slaves arrive. There is a lot of dispute over whether or not they were treated as indentured servants. Pretty much the agreement was that, yes, they were at first considered to be for a limited amount of time, but after a while, it was assumed that because of the color of their skin, as well as because of the expectation of other settlements, that Africans would not be treated as white indentured servants, but rather as slaves for life. That same year, in 1619, we have the House of Burgesses. This is the first representative government in the New World. It's very important because it does establish the foundation of what our country's government will be based on, and that's a representative government. Keep in mind that those representatives there are of the eastern landholding region. Of course, you have those clashes between the underrepresented, shown here with Bacon's Rebellion, and the wealthy landholders. Bacon's Rebellion is important to keep in mind, that idea that voting for delegates was restricted to landowners, so your former indentured servants, your poor landholders that ended up squatting on the western regions weren't being protected, and they fought for their rights, getting to the point of setting fire to Jamestown. The reason why this is important is when you think about that Synthesis, that complexity point where you might be comparing it to a previous time period. If you're looking at periods where people rose up feeling underrepresented, they felt that they needed to rise up to protect their interests. Bacon's Rebellion is really your first example of that in 1676. Then we shift north to the Puritans and Plymouth. The Puritans had strict morals, strong religious beliefs. They were being persecuted in Europe for trying to purify the Anglican Church. So at this point, they're going to come to the New World where they can practice their religion without interference. Remember, we've talked about this. They did not believe in freedom of religion, but rather their ability to practice their religion freely. The Pilgrims arrived in 1620. They came on the Mayflower, and of course, the very first thing they did was establish the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was the first written constitution. It was the written agreement about how the colony would govern themselves. You all read that, and it could be another reference point as a point of synthesis. Then in 1630, we are going to have the Massachusetts Bay Company, which is going to sail with 1,000 people, 17 ships. It will be the largest single migration in the 17th century. The leader of the Massachusetts Bay Company was John Winthrop. John Winthrop was elected the governor, and he believed that they were forming a holy commonwealth, a model city upon a hill. Puritans believed they had a special covenant with God, and they would have a moral society that would serve as a beacon for others to follow. God would reward them with peace and prosperity. The Puritans had a theocracy. Church was almost indistinguishable from state, no freedom of religion. Though all freedmen could vote, these were all men who were members of the church. So whereas in the South you had to be a landholder, in the North you had to be a member of good standing in the church. All the taxes supported the Puritan church, and law required church attendance. So you can see here some of the settlement of New England. Keep in mind the fact that if you look at that little green box right there, you have the meeting house in the middle. The meeting house, of course, is where not only the church was, but also the meeting house was where the government would reside, and that's where your town meetings would happen, which is where all members of the vote, or all members who could vote, would be able to participate. Now, the Puritans had also some clashes with Native Americans. That's both Pequot's and King Philip's War. The Pequot Nation decided to take a stand against the colonists, and so in May 1637, the English and Narragansett, who were another Indian tribe, set fire to the Pequot fort on Mystic River, where they slaughtered most of the Pequots as they tried to escape. King Philip's War took place in 1675. Where you'll see that it ends up from clashes between the English and the Indians, where, the Indians would attack a white settlement, so the whites would retaliate and destroy an Indian village. And it, of course, only ended when King Philip, or Metacom, Chief Metacom, was killed and his wife and son were sold into slavery. When we look at the Maryland colony, Maryland was established in 1634. It was a proprietary colony. The biggest thing about Maryland was established as a safe haven for Catholics. A law that you need to know here was the Maryland Act Concerning Religion, or the Maryland Act of Toleration, which established that Catholics would be able to practice their religion without interference. Also, keep in mind that Maryland and Virginia are both Chesapeake colonies, and that was because they both had tobacco as their primary agriculture, and they both used the headright system, and they both had representative assemblies. Pennsylvania colony was established by William Penn. It was supposed to be a safe haven for Quakers. However, not many Quakers wanted to emigrate to the New World. They just weren't that many in numbers to begin with, so he opened up settlement to all Europeans, and so you had a large number of Germans who came and settled in Pennsylvania. That's how you get the Pennsylvania Dutch. And it was a thriving colony where they relied on agriculture, pretty much grains, as well as some shipbuilding and other farming. Connecticut was established by Thomas Hooker. He defied the governor of Massachusetts and led his group west. He had a very strict religious government. The They had both you had the Fundamental Articles of New Haven, which was a Bible-based government that was even stricter than Massachusetts Bay, and they believed very strongly in holding to the Puritan faith. Then you had the Rhode Island colony. Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island, was a firm separatist. He believed that the Massachusetts Church should abandon all allegiance to the Church of England, believing that it could never be pure as long as it was tied to the king. He also believed that the land that the colonists occupied belonged to the natives. So, after the government of Massachusetts tried to deport him, he escaped. He got a charter from Parliament and bought land from the natives, and established in 1644 the colony of Rhode Island with the town of Providence. Rhode Island, being a separatist colony, said that it did not have any ties between church and state, so it will be the only colony where all faiths, including Judaism, could worship without interference. However, despite that, for the most part, most of the people who settled in Rhode Island were Puritans. Another dissenter was Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson believed that worshippers needed neither the church nor its ministers to interpret the Bible for them. She believed that all people could read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. She also questioned whether or not the clergy were really members of the elect, thus those predestined to go to heaven, because of her dangerous thoughts, such as that idea that anyone could interpret the Bible for themselves, so why would you need the minister? Or whether or not the minister was truly holy, thus also questioning the members of the elect, because the members of the elect not only were the leaders of the church, but they were also the leaders of the government. She was banished, where she went to New York, where she and her family were killed. Speaking of New York was originally settled by the Dutch in 1621 to colonize and expand on the fur trade. However, very few Dutch colonists wanted to come over, so they opened their doors to people of all countries. So a lot of German, French, Scandinavian, other Europeans will settle in that area. We see a lot of religious tolerance. The Dutch were more interested in trading furs with Native Americans than conquering them. Because of the fact that they didn't have a very strong settlement there, you end up having the English being able to take them over very quickly and rename the colony New York. When it comes to the West Indies, at first they raised tobacco, but with encouragement from the Dutch, they began to raise sugar, which the Dutch marketed. At first they used indentured servants with tobacco and even sugar. However, sugar demanded an even larger labor supply, so they're going to turn to African slaves instead. The Carolinas were originally settled as restoration colonies because of restoring Charles II to the throne. North Carolina settlement came from three directions along the border with Virginia, French Huguenots, and then also some from South Carolina. South Carolina was established first with Charlestown in 1670, but by 1712 they're going to split, with South Carolina being focused mostly on rice as well as indigo, and North Carolina being focused more on tobacco, lumber, and pitch. And then, of course, Georgia, which is our penal colony or our debtor colony. It was to move poor people or debtors to America. It was also a defense against the Spanish and a buffer zone between profitable South Carolina and Florida. It will not be established. It will be the last colony to be established in 1752. Now we're going to look at Colonial Society. This is moving more into the 1700s, which is era 2. The tobacco economy of the Chesapeake, profits were good, but it exhausted the land. We saw a plantation system with the headright system. Keep in mind that within the unhealthy Chesapeake, families were few and fragile. Men couldn't necessarily find wives. Marriages were often destroyed by death, and few children lived under two-parent care. So they will have a successful struggle by acquiring immunity to disease, and by 1700 they'll be growing on the basis of birth rate. New England towns were more orderly in their expansion. They relied on Puritanism. They had the Old Deluder Act, which said that any town with 50 or more families had to establish a school, which is why you see that Harvard and Yale will be the first two universities or colleges built in North America, which will be there to train ministers. The story of New England was written by the rocks, the idea being that because it had such rocky soil, they weren't able to engage in as much agriculture. Most of their agriculture was subsistence based, so just growing enough for their families. So instead, they ended up having more of a diversified economy where they relied on fishing, shipbuilding, and other commerce. From 1700 to 1775, we see conquest by the cradle. The population had a tremendous population growth, both immigration of whites and forced black immigration, but also remarkable natural fertility. By 1775, the average age was 16. It becomes a melting pot. The basic was English with most of the people, but we saw a lot of immigrants, German immigrants, Scotch-Irish, French Huguenots, Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, etc. We saw ethnic diversity, though the South was generally a white-black composition and most of the white were of English stock. New England was mostly English, but New York and Pennsylvania were the most diverse, which helped create a multicultural national identity. When it came to politics, most colonies had two house legislatures. The governors and the legislatures often clashed in the fact that the legislatures controlled the governor's salary. So even if the legislature and the governor didn't agree on something, the governor was sort of forced, his hand was forced by the legislature. Remember, the governor was often appointed by the king or by the proprietor, which meant he wasn't necessarily answerable to the legislature like the legislature was to the voters. So that control helped make sure that governors were held in check. Local government, we had town meetings in the north, whereas we had county governments in the middle and southern colonies. When it comes to the workday in America, the leading industry was agriculture. In the Chesapeake, you saw mostly tobacco and wheat. The middle colonies was grain. New England was fishing and shipbuilding, all engaged in commercial ventures and land speculation. That's the buying of land at lower prices, hoping to sell high. When it came to manufacturing, they manufactured rum, iron, and lumber. Keep in mind that these are not factories. This is not the manufacturing you think of when you think of the market revolution or the industrial revolution. This is very, very basic. And then all the colonies engaged in international trade. The Americas became an important part of the Atlantic trade. And with the increasing population, they began to demand not only more British goods, but also more goods from other nations, which led to the Navigation Acts, which tried to restrict American colonies' trade to that only of England. However, through salutary neglect, for the most part, the colonies will be able to get away with not only trading with England, because there will be the ability for, as long as there's a favorable balance of trade, then being able to trade with other nations. The First Great Awakening was very important. It was a religious revival in the 1730s and 40s. The two main leaders of this were, of course, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Jonathan Edwards made a very famous sermon called Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God. George Whitefield was even better than Edwards when he started 4 years later. These preachers really, it was all hellfire and brimstone. It was a very angry God. It was a very, that you had to repent or else you were going to burn in hell for all eternity. And they were considered the new lights, the ones who are really trying to bring people back to the church versus the old lights, the more traditional ministers. This led to some new light centers like Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. But the biggest thing about the Great Awakening is it is the first religious experience shared by all Americans. And in many ways, it was the first experience shared by all Americans. This is going to lead to a rebellion. Rebellion against the Anglican Church and then the English authority. You have to realize that, that when we talk about the American Revolution, it started in the taverns. It also started at the pulpit, and it was where the taverns were the clearinghouse of information. The pulpit, the preachers were the ones that convinced people to follow. So, as I said, taverns were the clearinghouse of information along the waterways where people could get a bite to eat, get a drink, but also find out what was going on in other colonies. And this is where the Sons of Liberty were founded in a tavern. The taverns are where the committees of correspondence shared their information. The taverns were extremely important. Education, New England and the Middle Colonies had primary schooling. Remember that old Deluder Act in New England. In the South, education was pretty much reserved for the rich. And when we talk about this, we're talking about primary schooling. When it comes to secondary education, in all of the colonies, it's pretty much reserved for the rich. When it comes to art and literature, there were influences from Britain and Europe. For example, you might have Phyllis Wheatley, who was a famous American poet, but she had been taken to England in 20 to be given some polish. You have Ben Franklin with his Poor Richard's Almanac, which was really preaching the homespun virtues of thrift industry, morality, and common sense, which leads to some progress, but also some lagging beliefs. So all of the colonies by 1750 were English in language and customs. All were Protestant in religion, though some had more religious tolerance than others. There was some ethnic and religious toleration due to diversity developing. Most of that was in the Middle Colonies, but you do start to see it developing in some of the New England colonies or even Southern colonies. You saw unusual opportunities for social mobility because there were opportunities to make money in this new world or to get land that allowed for some changes in class. All colonies had a measure of self-government, and communication and transportation were improving. The next review will focus on Era 3, which is 1754 through 1800. This will be the French and Indian War, causes of the American Revolution, and the foundation of the new nation.